Welcome to Mindful AI, the podcast that delves into the world of AI and its responsible use and development. I'm your host, Natasha Fong, founder of Centre, a provider of mindfulness programs for workplaces. This episode is a recording from Spark Festival's AI&U panel on the topic of AI for humans, responsible, safe and ethical artificial intelligence. AI&U was a 2-week exploration in May 2023 of all things AI that took place in locations across Sydney's Tech Central and supported by the City of Sydney. In fact, I was inspired by this festival to start this podcast series as I learned so much about AI in the 2 weeks, and it was too good not to share the wisdom from it. The panel was facilitated by Matthew Newman of TechInnocens, which specialises in the adoption and implementation of emerging technologies. And speakers from the panel include Beck Johnson, an AI ethics doctoral researcher at the University of Sydney, Lorenn of the AI&U School of Cybernetics and the Centre for Public Impact. There was Paul Conyngham of Intelligence, and he's also the director of the Data Science and AI Association of Australia. And lastly, Didar Zowghi of CSIRO's Data 61 on diversity and inclusion in artificial intelligence. Now, the recording quality isn't the best, so before I cut to the event, here's 5 key takeaways. Firstly, AI development needs to slow down and make space for reflection to allow us to consider unintended consequences and check if the technology aligns with our values. You'll hear from Lorenn, who says that startups and companies need to build in reflection space to consider AI's unintended consequences, and scenario planning and Black Mirror exercises can help with this. She also says that these reflective practices often lead to product innovation as companies gain a deeper understanding of their technology and users. However, she also says that incentive structures don't currently value slowing down. Second takeaway was that the cultural context in which AI is built shapes the technology and in turn its effects. We need to bring in more diverse, inclusive and local perspectives to counter the predominant Western tech outlook. Lorenn also voices her insights around tapping into Indigenous knowledge and ways of thinking as one approach. Third takeaway, there's a lot of hype and misinformation about AI that leads to 2 extreme views, that AI will end humanity or AI will solve all our problems. The truth is in the middle. We have to curate balanced perspectives to develop a nuanced understanding, and Beck Johnson will talk about this. She asks us to consider where we are on the spectrum of views on AI's risks and benefits, and then choose diverse, credible sources for information to avoid extremes. She also voices that studies and polls are often flawed or agenda-driven, so we need to look closely at the methodology and who is actually being quoted or surveyed. Fourth takeaway, humans have a hard time perceiving gradual exponential changes, but AI development is accelerating rapidly. Paul Conyngham shares that it's important to consider where AI is headed and have discussions to ensure it aligns with human values. He also says that those developing and regulating AI need to understand the pace of progress. His view is also that the gap between AI and human-level intelligence may close very quickly. Final takeaway, for companies and startups adopting AI, practical steps include articulating your values, building a diverse team, conducting risk assessments, and choosing AI suppliers carefully based on transparency and responsibility. Policymakers and researchers also have a role to play in incentives, funding, and setting standards. Didar voices her concerns about students using AI to shortcut learning and critical thinking, and she thinks that we need to educate students on using AI as a tool to augment rather than replace human capabilities. She also compares AI progress to advances like printing press, railroads, and automobiles that brought both opportunities and losses. We must think long-term about how to ensure AI benefits humanity. Finally, as with any technology, we need policies and safeguards to promote responsible development and use. But we shouldn't panic or avoid progress. With proactively managing risks, AI can improve lives, but we must act now given the pace of change. So now we'll cut to the event, and do excuse the audio quality.
Matthew is the sort of founder and CEO of TechInnocens. He's an expert with a long experience in digital transformation. Most recently, he's turning that long experience to the very important topic of artificial intelligence and empowering leaders how to integrate AI and other emerging tech with ethics and trust in their organisation. So I'll hand over to Matthew and he will introduce the panel.
Thank you. This works? Okay, so don't stand ceremony, panel coming up. I'll introduce you and you grab your seat. There's been a lot of recently, the past few years, on responsible use, AI ethics, etc. The last 6 months, though, has seen quite a profound change in technology. Things like ChatGPT. We've seen this technology, they're using their own hands, etc. So the challenges for society and the challenges for AI ethicists have changed over the past 6 months. So this evening, what I want to do is maybe avoid some of the same old kind of stories we might have heard over the past few years, avoid the cliches and the same use cases, and really look at what's happened in the past 6 months, what's happened with ChatGPT and other generative AI, and the impact that's had on AI ethics, and could have on all of us. So panel coming up, and I'll introduce you and grab your seat. And take your time, so
and actually, while that happens, I forgot to point out we have Slido this evening. If you would like to have questions in there, I will check it later on. In fact, I'll turn the screen on to show.
I don't mind you sit where you please, you're all good.
To show the Slido.
So, taking a seat first then, Beck Johnson is a doctoral researcher in AI ethics at the University of Sydney, where she focuses on value alignment of large language models and generative AI. Beck spent a year at Google Research in the Ethical AI team and Responsible AI division. She's managing editor of the Ethics Journal, chaired the highly regarded Chapter 23 conference at the University of Sydney, and also founded the global group PhD Students in AI Ethics. In 2020, she was listed in the well-regarded 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics. Next to Beck, we've got Lorenn. Lorenn is undertaking a PhD in Cybernetics at AI&U School of Cybernetics. She has a focus on putting the principles into practice in AI development and putting dignity at the centre of technology. She's a responsible tech collaborator at the Centre for Public Impact, and as well as being an independent advisor to organisations on responsible AI, strategy and innovation. Previous to all this, she was a director at PwC's Indigenous Consulting Practice. Lovely to have you. Next to Lorenn, we have Professor Didar Zowghi. Didar is a senior principal researcher at CSIRO Data 61. She leads the science team for diversity and inclusion in artificial intelligence research. She's also the leader of National AI Centre's think tank for diversity and inclusion in AI. With a substantial 21 years as a full professor for engineering at UTS, her focus is requirements engineering, business analysis, and in particular, evidence-based and human-centered design research. Didar serves on the program committee of many national and international conferences and has over 200 published research articles to her name. Impressive stuff, really. I feel quite humbled to be here. Finally, then we have Paul Conyngham. Paul is co-founder of Core Intelligence, which is a technology company which specialises in best-of-breed technology services with a philosophy to drive innovation and automation to customers by enabling their business and technological goals. Paul is also director for the highly active and respected Data Science and AI Association of Australia, which is a not-for-profit connecting data scientists and the machine learning community of Australia, and I highly recommend going to one of his events because they're fascinating. Okay, I'll take a seat as well. A brief warm-up for everyone first, I guess. The past 6 months has seen a massive change in the general public's experience of AI. It's gone from being something that's perhaps more niche and more for the kind of geek community to something that everyone's affected by day to day. The AI ethics community and discipline has been around for quite a while, but I'm interested in understanding, hearing from you, not so much the solutions yet, we can come to that later, but what new challenges have kind of arisen from this rapid change in the growth of generative AI, large language models, ChatGPT, etc.
The biggest change that when, in January or December when ChatGPT became to it in January, is the incredible increase in misinformation around these technologies. And that's been probably the most challenging thing from my perspective, is whatever morning TV show going, oh, it does this and it does that. It's like, no, it doesn't. And then you've got everyone writing articles and whatnot, so everyone's kind of wants to be part of this revolution. And I think that makes it difficult for the public to sort out fact from fiction, even if everyone involved in this situation is well-meaning. I would really like to see some government support and collaboration with CSIRO and universities to better address this campaign of misinformation, because people want to know, and they want. I think that the public hasn't been treated with the level of intelligence that they actually have.
So I think one of the things for me is that the past few months have been good in the sense that there is a heightened awareness of this, and it is in the public discourse, and I agree with Beck that it can have a negative underbelly. For me, I feel like some of the overarching questions around a recognition that we are humans shaping this technology, and that technology is in turn shaping us, and that is a fundamental understanding that we are not passive recipients of this technology, that we're active in shaping it, and that it is active in shaping us back. And if we think historically, this has very real implications on shaping us as humans. So I always like to think back to when an axe was a new technology. Archaeologists have now pieced together that they think, there's a theory, that the axe was a fundamental reason for why we became an upright species. Because to wield an axe, you needed more force, and that was better done from an upright position. This is a really interesting way of thinking about how these technologies are shaping us as humans across a very long time frame. And so we're at a really interesting moment in time now where these technologies are there, they're being designed by humans, contrary to some of the hype that you might hear. We are still in control of designing them, and we're putting particular values inside of what they are and what they're doing. And we need to be really conscious of the implications of that, not just from the technology perspective, but also for us as humans, for society more broadly, and also for the environment. And that's where a cybernetic perspective is really interesting and important here, because it's not just talking about the technology in isolation, but it's putting it in a much broader system of dynamics. And that's sort of where some of the school's perspective on this particular emerging evolution of technology comes into play. So overall, I think it's interesting time for us to be living in, to be able to translate and try and understand these technologies and work out that, you know, they're always going to be changing, and this is an unfolding and evolving conversation. So I'm really interested to see how we continue to tackle that.
Absolutely. Didar, kind of really heavily involved. You run this community, data science and AI community, so you're involved heavily with a lot of these. How are they reacting to these sudden changes in regards to, are they taking seriously the responsible AI, the safe AI message, or are they feeling compelled by this urgency, this fear of missing out to move forward with development? Have you seen any changes in the way the community are reacting to this, and are they starting to perhaps disregard safety in favour of?
I think one of the reasons why AI has been able to move so fast is because it's largely unregulated. And from the get-go, there's been, even now, data scientists don't give much thought to responsible ethics or safety.
Okay, that's slightly worrying. I mean, Beck, what's your feeling then? Who's in charge of the rules? I mean, it sounds like there's no legal frameworks in place, no regulatory frameworks. The engineers at these large companies at OpenAI and Google, where you worked, how are they setting their own boundaries of what's being developed? And, you know, is there some sort of consensus amongst these organisations as what's acceptable and what's not? Is there any way that they're controlling themselves and measuring, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's the thing that a lot of people ask, and I say to people, because we're these broader socio-technical systems, and what I see is that a lot of these, the bulk of these technologies at the moment are coming out of the US. What is the broader of that system is runaway capitalism, essentially. And so the most powerful player in this system is the fact that people are racing to get the biggest model, the best model, whatnot. And so that leads to a thing called SOTA chasing or state-of-the-art chasing, which means that some people will cut corners. So you can have, oh yeah, this is our list of our policies, I'm responsible, whatnot, and then underneath that is embedded some my research is. And that's fine, you can still pass your evaluation metrics if you lower the pass mark. A bit sneaky, and yeah, so who's going to regulate them? At the moment, Europe's doing a lot better than America, for sure. Australia has an opportunity to step in and do a lot better. I think it's a much better use of our money than quantum, to be honest, at the moment. But yeah, it's a really big issue because it is happening so fast, and there is so much pressure inside these tech companies to get out the next model that's bigger than buddy over there.
In Australia and New Zealand, what the companies are doing here to ensure that the AI is applied in a responsible, fair manner.
I maybe talk a bit about that and maybe add a positive spin, which is, so a lot of my research is working with startups who are using, say, GPT or other large language models inside their products. So they're not building the models, which I think is another realm, but they're using these models inside their products. And this is going to be something that is going to be a lot more common now that you have OpenAI's got the APIs have just been released, making it a lot easier for startups to just plug in and use these models in their products. And I'm really working with this potentially very small subset of entrepreneurs who actively recognise that they are shaping a future through the technologies that they're building, and if that they believe their own hype that they're going to be the next unicorn, they're going to impact a billion people, then, which they're selling to their funders all the time, then they have a responsibility that's associated with that. So I'm working with this subset who are in a way a demonstration case of, well, if you do have this view that you take on the responsibility, and we can talk about what that means for them separately, but you want to be responsible, like how do they actually do that in practice? And that's the work that we're doing together. And part of that is about being clear on principles, but it's also a recognition that this is not a retrofit activity. One of the overarching thesis for my research is you get in on the ground early on, you make this part of the organisational culture that they're thinking about what responsibility means for them, they're exercising that muscle in their decision making, then the product, there's a limitation on, does that mean that they end up with a responsible product? Maybe, but surely it's more likely than the alternative. And I think that there will be more and more of these organisations that really want to be responsible, that recognise the power that they have, and they want to do that. Now, whether that changes the dial overall, if you still have big players creating the models and all of that, but when you think about where the true innovation could come, where the real disruption could come, then I do think that startups have an interesting role to play in potentially demonstrating that yes, you can be responsible, that can be a competitive advantage, that can win trust in the market, and that ultimately can be a draw card for investors, that you're de-risking what you're doing by taking on these things, as well as this sort of idea that you're being responsible so you can sleep better at night, that you're not actually contributing to making the world worse off. Glimmers of hope, and I suppose part of the research is to show some demonstration cases in practicality, and then maybe that will spur us to not, believe this narrative that being responsible is drudgery and going to slow you down and going to be bad for business, but actually can be a process for innovation and potentially winning market share as well.
Interesting. So, pick up a couple of the points you mentioned. I think we mentioned earlier the idea of kind of capitalism. We're going to dive into the depth of that, but it reminds me, or helps me recall, the leaked email from Google. The Moat. So I hope I'm not basically repeating their marketing here, but essentially the so-called leak was that they didn't see that there was a moat for themselves or OpenAI in terms of kind of maintaining a lead in the market for these models. So, Paul, Didar, I don't know which is first. Where do you see is this going to be a remedy to these kind of challenges? Can open source actually kind of answer some of these issues that a closed model has and encourage innovation but also responsibility at the same time?
Yeah, Matt, I think very much. Today, Google released something there was a conference called Google I/O, and they released a whole suite of new machine learning AI models and stuff. Essentially, all of the things they released, the open source community has already implemented. That's called InPainting. It was actually developed by the Stable Diffusion guys. That's open source, so the open source guys. But specifically to answer your question, if you want to align these models such that they're more responsible, if you want to have the same values as the values of your company or the values of your country, whatever it might be, you're going to need to get access to the underlying model. And with OpenAI, etc., they are closed behind APIs, so you cannot do the very fine tuning that's required. You can put guardrails around them. Community, you can get access to the heart and do the fine tuning.
Yes, I do believe in open source, and I do believe there's problems with holding a lot of this technology in these large, wealthy companies, and unfortunately, a lot of these technologies require huge sums of money to. But then there's always pros and cons, and so I don't know if you all remember last year created this model on the worst underbelly of the internet and got on YouTube and hey, I made the most racist, toxic model on the internet, mate. But there's always going to be people that want to do stuff.
Interesting, absolutely. Maybe even related to that, then what can Australia do then to encourage closed models? You don't actually get to have a say in how the models create, how it's trained. You don't get to have those insights. What can Australia do to have technology that better reflects our values? We're not a huge country. We don't have the clouds of pulling the engineers. Maybe could we build our own large language models? That's something we should do. What can Australia do to preserve their values in this technology?
The question was what can Australia do? And I think that fund more stuff. Specifically, I'm very biased here, so I'm just going to disclaim that. Is fund more startups. We Australia used to be leaders in what's called natural language processing, which is the underlying technology that this GPT, or part of it anyways. We used to be leaders. Most of our talent has all gone overseas because it was poorly funded. So you need kind of two things. You need your universities producing top tier talent, and you need the talent to then go to a sink a good Atlassian could have actually been one. So I think more funding would be very useful for keeping the talent here. And the side effect of that would be now we've got more people to think about the regulation too. Because it's now on everyone's minds because the whole industry is bigger in Australia.
That's it.
To add one more thing to this in terms of what Australia could be uniquely positioned to do is to draw on some of the work that Angie Abdullah and other Indigenous Australians have been doing in this space around how to think through different lenses and tapping into this amazing resource that we have, Aboriginal Australians, Torres Strait Islander Australians, and the worldviews that they take to not just AI development, but also the interactions, the human, non-human interactions, which is very commonplace in a lot of mythology and dreaming time stories in Indigenous culture, where there's a lot of story time around people in relationship with non-human entities. And I think that there has been some work already done by this in terms of Indigenous AI protocols and other aspects, which I think is really interesting and an important sort of thread to this conversation, which, as you mentioned, has been very US or at least Northern Hemisphere dominant culturally, and forgetful of that a cultural lens from the US or from a Google culture is very niche actually in the context of the whole world. And Didar had a talk a few weeks ago at the conference that Beth was convening, and you had this really great slide about the internet and the things on the internet as being actually a representation of A, people that have the internet, B, people that are very active voices on the internet, and I've forgotten what the last bit of it, but it was essentially you end up with misinformation, all of these things, and that is the data that is being used to build these models. So the models themselves are representative of a very particular part of the world, and then we go through this generalizability conversation that particular mode of the world is what it should be for everyone. So I think that Australia has a really unique position to play in terms of Indigenous wisdom in this context. And I think that we're not alone. There's other countries that have First Nations peoples, but there's also an emerging conversation around that we need to really foster.
Fantastic. Yeah.
I can also just say, if I can put now my CSIRO Data 61 hat on and say a few words about the stuff that we're doing, because CSIRO is National Science Agency, and therefore the things that we're supposed to be doing, in particular, Data 61 is the digital arm of the CSIRO agency. And so we have a very large, both by team and by fund, project on responsible AI. And we have responsible AI by design, looking how we can tap into and leverage vast knowledge, vast body of knowledge of software engineering that we have learned over 4 decades in the design of responsible AI from the moment of ideation, and looking at what can be done in the entire pipeline, end to end, that can help us in development and use of AI, as I was saying. And the most recent thing that I am advocating and calling out for people to join me is this notion that there are lots and lots of AI incidents that do get reported. And there are 2 online databases, free online databases. You can just go and Google AI incident database. You will find both of them. People do report them, but if you go and interrogate these databases, you realize there are very few incidents reported from Australia. And then I was a bit puzzled over, are we so perfect? Nobody actually giving any incidents on this? I don't think so. I think that those incidents are happening in Australia as well. But somehow, I don't think that our radars have been on up until now to see what we can do to learn from, learn from incidents and from mistakes. And so what I have developed is a framework that resembles or takes the analogy what the aviation industry many decades ago, and that is the black box approach, the flight recorder approach, where every flight now has one and records the whole flight, and when, God forbid, some crash happens, then that box is interrogated, analyzed, and a proper report is generated. And when I say proper report, something that has a very robust and systematic structure. And then this report is shared with all the manufacturers of flights, of aircrafts. And that one crash that happened, and the reason why it will never happen again. Never happen again. And so what I'm advocating is now we have to really put that mindset on and learn from our mistakes. Start really reporting these incidents. And I'm going to have a roundtable discussion next month. Anyone who's interested, please let me know, because I want to present my framework for doing this. It's a huge amount of work. I don't have the resources to do it myself, but I'm just calling all hands on deck to roll up the sleeves. And I really also have been talking to ABC and looking at their investigative journalists. We really need the journals on with this. We also need companies to come clean and say that, hey, we developed an AI and it didn't work because, or it worked but it's discriminated somebody, it worked but it harmed something. We want to put it out there so that somebody can analyze it and learn from this. So this is the approach that I'm taking, and I just wanted to let you know, and I'll put it out there.
Your black box idea at the conference the other day, was like my favorite idea at the whole conference. I was like, oh, that's so simple and so great. So yeah, I'm totally on board with that.
There's a certain irony actually in the culture, the Silicon Valley culture of move fast and breakthroughs is, whether you agree with it or not, is based very much on the idea of learning from your mistakes. And that's lost if you move fast breakthroughs and you sweep under the carpet. So, I mean, quick show of hands. I'm not sure how many people here actually work for a tech company. Don't worry, you're not going to be vilified or anything. Okay, so a few. Then it makes sense if we move the conversation kind of from what Australia can do to what can Australians do. So, the majority of the people here aren't able to control what these models are doing, and none of us work for OpenAI, I don't think. Most of the people in this audience then appear kind of users or leaders of companies who probably feeling a bit of the FOMO, kind of like, we've got to do this, we've got to go on the market, we really have to pick up this AI technology, probably feeling a bit uncomfortable with the unknown. What would your advice be to Australian, let's go for the business leaders, they run chain stores, whatever, who aren't technically advanced, this isn't their core business. What should they be doing with this massive wave of technology that threatens to splash over their companies? How can they kind of make sure that their values, the values of society, and the values of Australia, I'm happy to say whoever wants to do it first can do it first. Who's brave?
I'm not so sure of the values part, but like if on an individual level, I feel that like everyone in this room, everyone that's been attending the Spark Festival's AI&U events, take what you've learned from them and talk about them at like the dinner table and stuff. Just start getting people thinking about it. Because even though there's a much, much greater amount of people talking about it right now, I think there's still a massive chunk of people that aren't really thinking about this. So the more people that we can just have these conversations with, share what you've learned, I think that will help tremendously.
Yeah, I agree with what Paul is saying, but also the problem is that when you look at media, and in particular social media, you'll find that there is basically two different perspectives on this. The first one is the doomsday one, that everybody says, okay, AI is going to end the world, it's going to take our jobs, humanity is going to be extinct. And so we get these things. There's quite a lot of that. Then on the other side, you have all these beautiful technology lovers like me who will tell you that, oh yeah, AI technology is going to solve all our problems. We don't have to work anymore, we can just be enjoying ourselves and blah, blah. So there's these two ends of the spectrum. None of them are true, and the truth is somewhere in between. And you have to figure that out for yourself. What does it mean to you and to your life? So for example, my daughter is a lawyer, and the first thing that I thought about when GPT was released, I thought, oh, this can summarize. So great. And what do lawyers do? They're summarizing all the time. They have to read 300 pages. I remember when she was a student, she had to read 300 pages and turn it into a 10-page summary. So, oh, okay, now her job is going to be lost. And she said, oh, Mom, so her job is safe. Yeah. So I don't believe. But what I'm trying to say is that don't give in to either of the end of this spectrum. Read for yourself, make up your mind, and as Paul was saying, talk to others, and where in this spectrum you're in.
And Lorenn, can I ask you then, what advice would you give to the startup community? Because you work in this community, then you've found companies that are positive and trying to do the right thing. What advice would you give to the startup community who, kind of feeling the pressure to use these tools? And I don't pitch nice, and I very much enjoy them, but I think 3/4 of the pitches say, we use AI to do X. What advice would you give to them? How can they navigate the path and not stray too far, I guess?
Really practical thing from the work I've been doing so far is the importance of cultivating reflection space. When you're running really quick and everything's on a fast mode, you just don't actually think that much. 2-3 ripple effects down. Entrepreneurs have this capability, like they're really good at projecting the future. That's what they're doing all the time. They're projecting the future, they're projecting how many customers they're going to get. They're convincing funders that they're going to make this much money and revenue all the time. So it's a skill that they have. It's not one that's been directed so much to thinking about the ripple impacts of the technology they're building. And I think part of the reason for that is that the incentive structure isn't really there. The incentive structure is there for them to project crazy amounts of future revenue, but at the moment the incentive structures don't really value slowing down. And I think that there's real value in the companies themselves valuing making space to take that breather and to really live out their values. Because a lot of this is actually, it's not necessarily new stuff for them. A lot of organisations, they have values. They mightn't have them formalised, but they, generally speaking, founders come together because they share a certain value set. And a big part of it is them being quite conscious about how they're walking the talk of their values. And then when it comes to doing AI, that's just another instantiation of their values. And yes, there are complications and different things in that beast in the same way there is for everything else. But if there isn't that sort of breaker space, it's very difficult to be responsible without reflexive practice.
I read a very interesting article which suggested how you can approach that. It suggested when you have that period to reflect, run a Black Mirror episode inside your company. So, just literally take whatever it is and just say, what would this be like as a Black Mirror episode? Now, that's a little bit extreme. You kind of get pretty horrific scenarios out of quite innocent technologies, but what it does, it gives the ability to reflect, okay, what are other outcomes that I haven't maybe considered? If you're considering kind of that positive, the happy path and this bright, shiny future, it encourages you very much what other scenarios are possible. Now, we all hope that it won't be the Black Mirror episode, but it does give you the ability to just challenge your assumption that this is going to be a good technology, it's going to be self-evident, great, etc. So
yes,
it's fantastic.
And I think something else associated with that, and Black Mirror is a really great example, is that through that process, what has been happening, at least in the cases that I'm working with, is a lot of people are reluctant to do this because they're like, ignorance is bliss. If I just don't know, then I won't have to do anything about it. But what these guys are really finding is that if they're in the mode of Black Mirror, whatever the process is, they're thinking about these things, actually it's leading to product innovation. It's not lost time in the sense that, well, A, they have to be on the same page about what their technology is actually doing, because so many of the conversations we're having is, oh, is that what we're really doing? Like, the developer guy finally talking to the sales guy and the strategy guy, and then all actually understanding what the technology is doing, which is really important for pitching and explaining and whatever else. But it also then leads to product innovation ideas because they're leaning into the tension. They're okay with the ambiguity of not being able to solve it, which I think is important. And this is where I think entrepreneurs are a particular bunch. They're not like, we're overwhelmed with all of these problems. They're used to solving problems. They solve problems, a million of them every single day. So why is this any different? If you're doing the Black Mirror, that's just not going to create a mountain of problems that then overwhelms you and you don't want to do it again. With the right perspective, which I believe a lot of entrepreneurs have, that actually leads to very tangible conversations about, okay, we really don't want that to happen. So if we just did this on the product feature, that would probably help that a lot. Or, oh, I didn't realize that if we're using this underlying thing, we're actually endorsing X, Y, and Z. We don't really want to be about that, so let's do this alternative thing. And it is a very fruitful way of actually having an innovation conversation.
Absolutely. So with that Black Mirror in mind, last kind of question, we'll take some from the audience, strong opinions. Didar mentioned earlier, the idea is two extremes. The idea of kind of like this technology is fantastic and wonderful, it's going to kill us all. It's in the press very often. You get kind of experts who are confessing already that they've probably done something terribly wrong, and there's been letters asking for pauses in case for 6 months. And this is something that the general public is now becoming very aware of. It's moved from being science fiction to actually having people who we should trust saying that there is a real present danger here. There is a danger that this gets out of control and that we end up in a very dark place. What would be your kind of feelings on the subject, and what would you say to the audience here on how seriously they should take that?
Okay. Didar's right, it is a spectrum, and you've got to find your place on the spectrum. There is also a lot of misinformation, and we've got to also think about, in this bigger context of the world, who do we traditionally give power to different voices? We tend to be old white men so we hear Jeffrey Hinton, and we hear from Elon Musk, and we hear from Ian LeCun, who honestly says some pretty crazy stuff these days. And so they're the voices that we tend to give power to. And it's hard. It's hard because AI is a fire hose of information at the moment. And I was going to say this in response to what the other speakers here have said. What do you do on a personal level? It kind of plays into this question as well. There is so much information out there. There's so much misinformation. There's so much hype. Things like the polls letter, honestly, in my view, are just a giant PR campaign. Like, honestly, oh, I invented the wheel, but hey, I'm just going to pause it for 6 months. Like, it's just not going to happen. So think about where you are on the spectrum, and then think about where you want to get your information from this fire hose. And create that reflection space, but you need to curate your space. Very practical level, I would suggest go on 20 people, whether they be journalists or people on Twitter or Mastodon or whatnot, that you think, okay, I'm going to filter some of my information through these 20 people. Maybe 10 of them are really within your bubble of this is what I believe, but pick the other 10 to push your boundaries, so you want to stay in your little comfort zone. And go and seek diverse voices to listen to. Don't just be listening to Elon Musk all the time, like, honestly. Go and find some people from different backgrounds, from different countries, some females or some people of color, so try and diversify where you're getting your messages from. Because you'll find, there was a study recently about, 50% of, but when you delve into that study, it was terribly flawed. The methodology was flawed, it was self-selecting, and if you go into Appendix H, you'll find that actually most of the people saying that were white men in America and whatnot, but that's not a sexy headline. So I tried to tell all that to my students, and even they kind of glaze their eyes over, and it's like, it's much more sexy to say, Skynet's here.
Yeah, I saw Skynet up here actually. I mean, Paul, I started with Jen and said, is Skynet coming? I read them as they come up, I'm sorry. So, do we face something as profound as that? Now, these are all of the market movement, don't we? And Paul, your opinion, is there that kind of threat there? And I know this is sensational, but it's probably something that's on people's minds.
So I've been an AI practitioner for 14 years, and I've seen the technology go from being barely useful to ChatGPT in the space of 14 years. The other thing I'll say about this is that humans are very bad at spotting exponential trends, and we're living through one at the moment. Our brains evolved over the plains of Africa to track linear relationships, a cheetah or a gazelle or something. What that means is we find it very hard to spot when you have an exponential acceleration in something. Right now, if you see the pace at which machine learning papers are being published, it fits an exponential perfectly. I think it's very important to be having these conversations that we're having today, because we need to start shaping where this is going to go in the future, because it's not being shaped at the moment. Well, the first attempts are happening right now. Yeah. Really, people in this room are probably some of the biggest players in the space. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Didar, Nora? Anything? No?
Well, I mean, I've forgotten what the question was, but
is actually a serious threat, a credible threat, this kind of AGI, the idea of superintelligence? Is this something that people should be worried about because they're hearing about it? What was clearly science fiction is now gone, be they old and white and American, but people who you would imagine you could trust and listen to have got serious faces and serious messages. Should people be worried?
I think my honest answer is yes, that we should worry about it. And not that we should lose sleep over it at night, but when you do worry about something, then you do something about it. If you don't worry about it and you chill and relax, and you think, okay, there are these other clever people, then who can think about it? I think that just like any technology, and I've been through several in my life, people's life. With technology, there's always benefits and there's also losses. And this is nothing to do with software or hardware. You go back to, so there was a loss for carriage drivers. They couldn't be doing the carriages. And you just look at, for example, the technology that brought printing into the world made a lot of losses. And by loss, I mean job losses, as well as other things. And the other things that I think we have to be really careful about is losing our ability to think and act like humans. And by that, I can tell you that I have already seen that students already are using ChatGPT to do their homework for them. They don't want to think because, I'm not saying that GPT has made them be like this. Most students, not all students have always been looking for shortcuts, and I don't want to mention the P word, it is plagiarism, but it's been around, right? And all of us who've been students know that there are students who plagiarize. So it wasn't a new thing, but this is a new tool to plagiarize much faster and quicker and not be able to. What does that mean? It's going to make the future generation stupid? Not be able to write anything because ChatGPT was able to write it for them? So this is what actually keeps me at night. It's about the future of humanity in relation to all those things that we are good at, and the machine is not quite as good as us yet, but it will. So what do we do?
I'm just going to ask a couple of questions.
Can I just add something to that?
Oh, sorry.
No,
You've seen
just
that.
one. Good one. So just something to add to that conversation about futures is that I think that there is a really important role for science fiction and other narrative creative storytelling shaping how we think about the future. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of the public discourse talks about, Terminator, or things that come from arts, essentially, and they become part of our imagination, and then some people try and build them in some way so that they can hook onto that collective imagination. So I think that there's a real role, and technology companies do hire science fiction writers and other futurist types to help think about the future and help them with their tech design. So I think again this comes back to what's influencing how we think about the future, and science fiction writing and other creative endeavours certainly do push the boundaries of how we think about the future, and then that becomes a very important hot spot for diversity of thinking as well, because something like the Terminator has a very strong discourse, when we talk about future of technologies and all these doomsday types of conversations. That's one future that was created in an arts context that captured our collective imagination and has taken on a life of its own. So how do we build that pipeline, diversify that pipeline for the multiple futures that are possible, and in turn that could spur different types of technologies as well.
So Black Mirror might actually have been a really helpful aid for looking to the future. Fair enough. I think it's good to watch it. Okay, let's go to some questions from the audience. I'd be happier if the person who actually wrote it felt comfortable asking it, because it would be really useful just to understand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Beautiful. I mean, that's very detailed. Can we? I'm impressed that I got the most votes, actually, 6, because it's an extremely detailed question. I don't envy who has to answer that, but please go ahead.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. Maybe a bit of background. I'm doing a bit of research into how bias has affected AI models in the past, and obviously with the rise of LLMs in the last few months, this is becoming a more widespread problem. As you put it, this tool is now in the hands of more people. I think in the past, there have been interesting ways that researchers have developed to help mitigate bias. A popular one, for example, is counterfactual fairness. I'm wondering, now that I guess the dominant type of AI that people are using day to day are LLMs, do these same approaches to mitigating bias apply?
Anyone in particular, or are you happy for someone to put a hand up?
So I guess I didn't hear all of what you said about bias detection, bias handling. Yeah, so certainly there are many evidences already emerging about large language models also being biased towards one or another groups. But I just want to step back and say that look around you. We as humans are not perfect in handling bias and mitigating biases. We do discriminate, unfortunately, through unintentional and unconscious bias, sometimes conscious bias. So, therefore, if you think about that large language models have been trained on unconsented data being scraped, massive amount of it, from the internet, obviously those biases find themselves into any AI that is trained on historical data that is biased. There is quite a large body of research at the moment that only looks at to identify and remove biases, and basically to try and pave the path for a more fair kind of treatment of humans by the machine, if you will. And I think this line of research will continue, even with large language models. The reason is because large language models, at the moment, we don't have yet feeding in what is going on right now into the large language models, but it will come very soon. Okay. Whether this is going to perpetuate, increase that bias, or whether it's going to bring it down automatically is yet another question. And you ask that question from any of these tech giants, they tell you, I don't know, it's a black box, I can't explain, which is really, really, really bad.
You have a view as well on this?
Yeah, so this is actually a large part of what my research is on. Your first thing I want to say is bias cannot be removed. The actual definition of bias is a perspective. And so then we talk about alignment, and we talk about how aligned is this model to this population of people, or how appropriate is it in this particular use case or context. And so then it becomes a matter of, we can also fine-tune the models. So there's a technique called RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. And but a lot of the issues with that are, well, which people are you using? What are the demographics of the people that are doing the reinforcement learning? And then there's a whole bunch of. But I think the bigger question is, and opinion of what Didar said, is that it's not like we can have some perfectly value neutral, shining language model that hits on all the right ethics, because we are incredibly diverse and pluralist society. COVID taught us that, There were like giant arguments of how we're going to deal with the pandemic, and that was just like one issue, right? So there's no way that we can, and so it needs to be obviously we need to remove toxic hate speech and all that kind of stuff, that's fine. But we also need to readdress how we're framing this question to be like more about alignment and the right use case for the models.
Fantastic. Yeah. Do you want to ask that or?
I was just going to say the current paradigm of LLMs, they've kind of exhausted parameters. RLHF they've come to the end of the fruits that can bear as a technique. But they are now going to go to broader things like counterfactual. The point is that they're going to start bringing in new techniques too.
It's just the last thing to say that you have to bear in mind that biases are very much contextual and situated. There are many countries in this world who absolutely have no understanding and no interest in diversity and inclusion, right? And because I work in that space, I know for a fact that what we are talking about is for a small portion of the world. And I just, Lorenn mentioned that the slide that I shared with you said that from roughly 8 billion people in the world, only half of them have access to internet, and from that half, most of them are quiet, passive kind of people in the background. There's only a very small minority of loud people who make their presence felt on the internet. And so you just have to, and when I say that bias is situated and contextual, there's people talk about positive bias and negative bias. I think it probably is more reasonable to talk about harm rather than bias, because you can be biased, but you may not cause harm. But then when bias turns into harm, that is what we have to be very about.
I think we've got time for another question. Peter's around somewhere. I'm going to choose his because they're all equal, so I'm allowed to choose whichever I want. The US election campaign, where there's kind of, it's labelled as this is generated, and we're seeing more and more really decent, hyper-realistic content. So, Peter, go ahead.
It's pretty self-explanatory that, and a lot of, they're really worried about misinformation. And it's true, we have enough spam, enough malware, and leaving in the hands of not even the worst actors. But, so if Australia had a way to protect what came through our filters, through our what was delivered to our inbox. If we don't do that, we could be totally inundated. I mean, you could imagine nothing would work. The whole society would stop,
What can we do to stop this kind of wave of misinformation and deep fakes and that's been, and does it come to some sort of firewall, because that doesn't sound like it maybe fits with our ideals. Anyone want to take that one?
I'll take a stab at it. So I think it's very dangerous to regulate, have some third party regulate what you get to see and not see. But when you're going to have a flood of artificial content flooding the internet, a problem that is going to emerge is verifying a human from a non-human. If I was to call any one of you in the audience, like give you a phone call and you heard my voice, how could you verify that you're actually speaking to Paul? Like, how do you know that? So that's going to become, that's definitely a problem, like that's an entrepreneurial problem right there that needs to be solved. Sam Altman, the founder or president, CEO of, has already actually created a company to work on that problem because he's hanging out with his tech bros, knows about it already. But yeah, I think, ironically, there might be some Web3 people here in the audience. Lots of good technology came out of Web3, but there's no real, like, in my workflow today, working before coming here, doing a bunch of work, I didn't use a single Web3 tool, not that I know of. But ironically, the tools that were created during the Web3 sort of phase are going to be needed to do the identity verification part. That's the irony of the whole thing.
So we're going to need blockchain after.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
So Google announced today that they're going to watermark everything that comes out of their generative AI. And I see that that's probably the way forward, that any legitimate company will watermark all the content. And then, because you don't want to just censor, you don't want to censor everything that's coming into your inbox, which makes it tough. But if we tell our inbox only accepting stuff that's watermarked, and that might force a lot of smaller companies and smaller actors to step up to that and say, you know, we're more watermarked as well. Obviously, some people will probably cheat, but I think that's a good step.
I think that part of the underlying reason for some of my focus on dignity gets to the heart of some of this question, because what I've been doing is thinking about the role, like how to think about dignity in a plurality of ways. And if you were to put that at the technology development and use, what that would mean. And one way to think about dignity is that there is a fundamental difference between a human and a non-human. There's a unique individual worth. And when you translate that into what that means when you're developing a product, then it becomes obvious that you would flag if you are not a human interacting with someone. Because if you're respecting the dignity of the human, you would be very clear, this is a human, this is a chatbot. And I think that there's in part of the work of developing this dignity lens, thinking about these different layers of dignity has been really interesting about what things become way more obvious when you think through this lens. So another one is one of the frameworks of dignity, which is actually being developed by a professor from Harvard who works in international conflict resolution, so completely not technical. She talks a lot about these elements of dignity, and one of the elements is giving the benefit of the doubt. And that there's a fundamental dignity associated with giving the benefit of the doubt. And when you think about that in the context of AI, which is all about prediction and categorizing people based on characteristics that they may or may not identify with and determining their future, this whole idea of how do I get given the benefit of the doubt becomes a really important question. It's a big critique of using AI for a lot of policy prediction and other things, is that once you've been determined that you're in this risk category, then that's just the insurance you get, or that's just the parole sentence you get. And then in order to undo that, there's the whole contestability processes and things like that. But if we think with dignity as a concept, having a way of not being so stringent becomes part of the design, and you might come up with a different way of thinking about it. And I think that when we're talking about this type of conversation about what the future might look like and how it will influence us, I think that there's real value in thinking about what dignity means and how we can manifest that in the design of the technologies up front.
That's a fantastic answer. I like it very much. In fact, I think I was going to have a round of one sentence, but that's an even better point to finish on. I'm very positive after a bit of, some of the conversation can be a bit darker, some a bit negative. I found it a very positive way to close things off. So I'd like to thank all of you for giving so much to the audience. It's been fascinating, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, everyone who's been here. thanks everyone who's attended all the AI&U events, and please stay, have a drink, have a glass of wine, have a chat with some of these amazing people, and have a chat with another human.
So there we have it, an insightful panel on responsible, safe and ethical AI from this really diverse panel here. The message is clear that we must act now given the pace of change, and that everyone has a part to play as AI becomes embedded in our lives. So the request is to share what you're learning, think critically about how AI impacts you, and push for responsibility. Collective voices and action can make a difference. Thank you for tuning into Mindful AI. I hope that our conversation has provided you with valuable insights and perspectives on the fascinating developments in AI. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media or via our website at Centre Meditation to share your thoughts and suggestions for future episodes. Thanks again for listening to Mindful AI, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful conversations in the future.